Pray with me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu ruach haolam, osei maaseh bereshit. Blessed are you, Holy One, our God, Spirit of life, who moves throughout the universe, who each day recreates the world as on the first day. God, open this day our eyes that we may see. Open our ears that we may hear. Open our hearts and make us one with you in creativity and in love. Amen. God is forgiveness, dare to forgive, and God will be with you. God is forgiveness, love and do not fear. I became familiar with that chant and many of those we use in worship here at First Church through the ecumenical monastic community of Taizé, a group of brothers who have gathered across lines of denomination and belief and race and country of origin to be in community with one another in the south of France. They're best known to the world through their music, through the beautiful chants that we sing over and over again, deepening into worship. But I became familiar with them through their work for justice and reconciliation. Specifically, a gathering of young adults that they convened at the invitation of the Oglala Lakota Oyate, the tribe on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, in the spring of 2013. And I was a part of a group of young adults, both native and non-native, who were tasked with doing the spiritual and practical work to welcome hundreds of young people from around South Dakota, from around the country, from around the world, to pray together, to eat together, to live in a camp together, and to work together for justice and understanding on a bluff above the Cheyenne River in the Badlands of South Dakota. And we were tasked during that meeting with trying to figure out how to do a prayer service, how to provide a framing device for a silent pilgrimage to Wounded Knee. If you are familiar with your frontier history, you may know Wounded Knee as the site of one of the worst massacres in the history of the United States, as women and children and men and others were, more than 300 were killed by U.S. cavalry in the dead of winter. It is a site of tremendous pain for my Lakota relatives, for Native Americans, an icon of the history of this country, which is so difficult and in so many ways so violent. And our task was not to go to this site to offer words, to offer a plan of action, to offer a political program, but our goal was to simply go there and be together in silence, to witness to the pain in that place, and perhaps through our witness, model what it would mean to be in communion with one another. So as we tried to figure out how were we going to frame this, what information did our pilgrims need to know, what information did our pilgrims, our young people need to have, and what kind of spiritual practice could possibly set us up for this intense and meaningful and fraught experience, we tried to find Taizé chants. Of course we did. We tried to find music and song that could help hold a container for this experience, and initially, we thought perhaps that God is Forgiveness song might be the one. It might be the necessary spiritual energy to bring on our pilgrimage. But the more we thought and the more we prayed, we realized that it wasn't really our place to be asking for forgiveness. Certainly not my place as a South Dakota-born white person. But even in the midst of a multiracial group, we came to the recognition that it was not ours to demand or to call for forgiveness of something which seemed and seems so unforgivable. Forgiveness is maybe the hardest part of Christianity. It's perhaps the most difficult thing that we are encouraged, called, invited to do by this Jesus of Nazareth character. It's difficult enough in our own relationships, our friendships. It's difficult enough in our interpersonal relations to love our enemies or to do good to those who hurt us. It's hard enough at that interpersonal level. But especially when we start to move beyond the interpersonal and into the realm of the social, the historical, the systemic, the global, it becomes trickier still. Because perhaps I can forgive somebody who's hurt me. Perhaps I can forgive the friend who hurt my feelings. Perhaps I can forgive the family member who neglected or abused me. I'm lucky not to have that in my past, by the way. But by way of example, perhaps I can do that for myself and for my spirit and for my life. But who gets to forgive Wounded Knee? Or slavery? Who gets to forgive a bipartisan consensus that allows hundreds of thousands to die so that people can keep going back to work and producing surplus value for a handful of salamanders in Silicon Valley? And I hear the voice of God saying, but they're children of God too, Tom. Even the salamanders. And that's why it's hard. That's why it's hard when you look around at injustices, historical and present, and you think to yourself, where does this Jesus character get off telling me to forgive that? Is it even my place to forgive injustices done to other people? What would be necessary for forgiveness? Can there be forgiveness without reparations? We are in the midst of Black History Month, after all. The question of how do we redress, how do we encounter, how do we move forward in the midst of great historical trauma? Forgiveness is the hardest part, perhaps. Loving our enemies is the hardest part, perhaps. And too often, people in positions of power, often, although not exclusively, people who look and sound like me, use forgiveness as a kind of cudgel. Too many churches are places where women or other survivors of abuse are told, you just need to forgive your abuser. You need to go back to that abusive husband. Because that's what Jesus would do, right? Or too often it is wielded as a cudgel against those who call for justice in the wake of great historical damage. Why are we still talking about slavery? Or Wounded Knee? Or what have you? Why are we still talking about it? Isn't that past the past? Aren't we supposed to forgive and forget? Too often, forgiveness, the very idea of it, gets wielded as a weapon to get folks to stop talking about the hard stuff, to get us to stop talking about the wounding. And I'm going to tell you right now, I don't have a particularly good answer to the questions that I've just raised. In much the same way that Anne suggested in our children's moment, I don't know that there is one good answer for about how enemies become friends and for how you redress historical injustices. Certainly I don't have any wisdom to dispense from here in my, well, I'm not exactly at a pulpit, but I'm up on the chancel. I'm in a robe, right? I speak on behalf of the Lord. Maybe. And if I say anything that's harmful or wrong in this sermon, I pray that it's all from me, not from you, God. And yet, in Christianity, we come back to this fellow Jesus, and forgiveness was one of his favorite themes, as you heard in our passage from the Gospel of Luke today. And this is part of what Luke calls the Sermon on the Plain. Of course, we are very familiar with the version in Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, which we heard the Beatitudes from last week and in our call to worship today. And Matthew is very invested in the idea of Jesus as a new Moses, as Jesus as the fulfillment of the covenant between God and Israel. And so, of course, he has Jesus up on a hilltop on the Mount of Olives, preaching and teaching and delivering this drash, this interpretation of Torah. Well, Luke has a fire for justice in his belly. And so for him, this passage, this sermon takes place on the plain in the midst of a gathered community of poor people, of sick people, of physically disabled people who are coming to this Jesus character because they've heard that he has the power to heal, that he has the power to bind up broken hearts. And so we must remember that as Jesus says these words, he's not standing in a position of power, anything but. He's on the plain in the midst of the people. And let us remember that Jesus is a poor, possibly illiterate, day laborer, a tekton, which could mean anything from a journeyman carpenter to Jesus standing outside of a Home Depot on a Thursday morning. He's a member of a too often rebellious religious sect. And though we know there was ferment, we know there was movement in this little corner of the land of Israel called Galilee, it remained an out-of-the-way corner of the much bigger Roman Empire. The only things Jesus could really have done to be more marginalized would have been physical disablement and or being a woman. But he was a mamzer, somebody whose parentage was unclear, because we know that although Joseph gave him his protection, Jesus was not Joseph's son. And in a context where that would have been very important, where parentage was so important, that was yet another layer upon Jesus' marginalization. So Jesus isn't somebody standing in the pulpit. He's not somebody talking on a major news network. He's not speaking from the halls of Congress, telling people below him in the social structure that they need to love their enemies. He's speaking as a poor man to poor people. And in much of society, maybe we don't think this guy's important. If you're not a Christian, maybe what Jesus has to say about forgiveness or justice doesn't matter. If you're a secular activist, or for that matter, a secular business owner, or a secular Department of Defense, Maybe this stuff about forgiving your enemies and doing unto others as you would have them do unto you doesn't have to matter to you, but we're in a church, and that means we have to at least think about it. We have to at least grapple with it. And so I want to dig us down a little bit into this idea of forgiveness, because I think it has something to do with Jesus' vision of society. I think it has something to do with Jesus' vision of community. I think it has something to do with Jesus' vision of God. And in order to drill down, I want to take us back a few weeks to Jesus' idea about Jubilee. Because we're only a couple chapters on at this point. We're only a few acts of the play on at this point, from the moment when Jesus stands up in his hometown synagogue and declares that today is the day of God's favor, that today is the day when debts will be canceled, today is the day when justice will reign, when the poor shall be justified, and when the prisoners shall be set free. A radical critique of a hierarchical world, a radical declaration that things are about to be turned upside down. And you may notice, and this is a favorite theme of mine, that when we talk about things like the abolition of debt or the redressing of historical injustice, we often talk about things like forgiving debt. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. It's not just a metaphysical concept, it is a very real economic metaphor. And it expresses something about the nature of God. Because if God's going to cancel all of those social debts, and that means all of them. That means all of them. Not the ones that we think deserve to be canceled. Not the ones that make sense in our accounting of economics or a relationship. At some important level, Jesus does not care what we think, because he's declaring the inbreaking of a reality that is so much bigger than all of our human calculations, and so much bigger than all of our human ideas about justice, and so much bigger than all of our human ideas about what we deserve, that in the end it gets him killed. It's such a radical vision that in the end it riles up people in power, and for that matter, people around Jesus so much. It is truly a radical vision. Okay, so this expresses something about the nature of God, about grace, about divine abundance. Sure, but does that mean, let's come back to the question because we haven't resolved it yet, what do we do? What does it mean to forgive? And here's something I think is important about this passage we just read this morning, is when Jesus says, if you lend to others and expect to gain back, what credit is that to you? If you love those who already love you, what credit is that to you? The Greek word here is charis, and it's the exact same word that gets used for grace. And I don't understand a lot about grace, not in a discursive way anyway, not in a way that I can put into words. But in my experience of grace, it does not have a timetable. In my experience of grace, it is not something that I can force. In my experience of grace, it is one of those things that comes at you unawares. In perhaps the moments when you least expect it, certainly in the moments in which we feel it is least deserved, and opens up new possibilities. Because I think that's the problem with so much of our language about forgiveness, is this idea that it needs to happen once and for all, and it needs to happen right now. That you got to figure out how to forgive your enemies, that we got to figure out how to forgive the world for being what it is instantaneously, and that's got to stick, right? And maybe at the deeper level at which God experiences the universe, in which all times are now, maybe that's true. Maybe it is instantaneous. Certainly, grace feels like a glimpse of something far beyond our human ways of understanding the world. But for most human experiences, time takes time. Whether it's building a church, whether it's developing a friendship, or whether it's repairing a friendship. Grace takes time, at least in our experience. And so when it comes to this matter of forgiveness, perhaps there are some things, to quote the pop singer Kesha, that only God can forgive. Perhaps this work of untangling the pain of the past, because that, in the Aramaic word for forgiveness, is the visual, is the embodied sense of forgiveness, is to untangle, to untie a knot, to loose the bonds that hold us captive to our past, to the trauma of what happened before. And perhaps in moments of tremendous pain and suffering, things get so knotted up that not only will it take a long time to unravel it, but the time required to unravel it might in fact be much, much, much longer than a single human life. Because if forgiveness is about grace, then that also means that it's not all on us to figure it out. So whether we are hurt by an intimate partner, and I want to clarify that as a survivor of intimate partner emotional and sexual abuse, I know firsthand, at least in that circumstance, how hard forgiveness can be, or whether it's even a good idea, whether that's even realistic to expect, whether that's actually helpful. Believe me, I understand, at least in my own experience, how knotted up that can get. I'm not offering a program. I'm not telling you need to forgive anybody for anything. But if grace is the underlying structure of reality, and if Jesus wants us to live in harmony with that, not but, and. Pain hurts, it is real. Victims are not to be blamed for their suffering, and grace is the underlying structure of reality. Perhaps that's why it's so hard to come up with a single answer to questions like this, is because two things are true at the same time. And maybe God's big enough to hold both of them. So whatever your journey of forgiveness might look like, toward whatever it might be, whatever time you need, or whether that time is far beyond the span that any of us can imagine to untangle the past. May we know that God is with us in the midst of it, that God is right there suffering with us. God is right there tangled up with us. And to return briefly to Pine Ridge in 2013, the song we eventually settled on is a Lakota translation of a poem by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German Lutheran theologian who was imprisoned for his resistance to the Nazis. another historical moment in which forgiveness kind of breaks down. But Bonhoeffer wrote this in prison, and it was translated into Lakota, and it goes something like this. Wakantangka awachin chie iyoyan paluha ohini mixuyaye wo kiena wachin tangkaluha tokel yaun shloyaye. And in English, that means, I do not understand your ways, O great mystery, but you know the way for me. May we remember that God is with us, even in the midst of the things we cannot understand, even in the midst of the pain which feels unresolvable. And may we trust in the grace that is the deep structure of all that is. Amen.